200 feet, right? That means everything west of I-95 is gone in the US. That means that every beach you've ever been on, so Enock, I'm sure you have a favorite beach. That beach is gone. My favorite beach is in Negril in Jamaica. My father is from Kingston, but when we'd go, we'd always go to the beach. I can't even imagine not having those beaches. Those beaches will be gone.
Welcome to Sustainability Transformations podcast, where we explore bold ideas to drive positive change for people, the community, and business. Today, we are dissecting the mechanics of influence. My guest is Maya. She's a producer, a speaker, and climate storyteller, leading the ES Project, an Emmy-winning media nonprofit that is redefining how the world understands climate change, named to the Grace 50 for changing the Hollywood's approach to climate storytelling, blends environmental science with creative vision to make the complex accessible through initiatives like Inside the Movement. She amplifies frontline voices to transform abstract issues into human narratives that motivate global change. Maya, welcome to the show. You sit at the intersection of documentary filmmaking and environmental science. But in the corporate world, we love our spreadsheets and our ESG dashboards. Take us back to the moment you realized that data alone wasn't enough, but what inspired you to do or use storytelling as a primary vehicle for climate change?
Oh, thanks for that introduction. And you packed so much into that one little moment. That was that was amazing. I was just listening like, is that me? Are you talking about me? That's amazing. Yeah, so I'm Maya Lilly. I'm one of the producers, just a shout out to the rest of my team. I'm not the founder or the CEO, but I'm one of the producers at the Years Project. We're a TV team that spun out of a TV show we did called Years of Living Dangerously, which was on Showtime and Nat Geo. It was produced by James Cameron, and it won the Emmy, and it was basically the response to Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, which came out in 2006. And then there was this blank amount of time where nobody in Hollywood was talking about the climate crisis. So it was the first unscripted TV show on climate. Because of that, we garnered a huge following on socials. And because so many people get their news now from social media, we shifted to doing a lot of original content on our platforms, on all social media channels at Years of Living or at the Years Project. And you can follow me at Gung Ho Eco. So realizing that story moves people more than facts, that was something I always knew as a kid. I grew up in an arts family. My mother was a drama teacher. I grew up on stage, ending up in a conservatory training education at Juilliard for acting. And I was studying a lot of Shakespeare, Chekhov. I was always in front of an audience as a kid, and I knew that people were moved by what they were hearing in a different way than if they were reading a report or listening to, a scientist talk about something. So I inherently knew that there was immediacy and power in the arts. When you said spreadsheets, my first thought was I actually flashed to me being in a room with a network trying to convince them that we needed a scene with scientists talking about a spreadsheet, and them ABC or Lionsgate being like, no, we're cutting that. We're cutting that. Because the thing that ends up on cutting room floors is people talking about a spreadsheet. What ends up on cutting room floors is conferences, like people on a panel at a conference. Can't use it in TV because what good storytelling is somebody confronting a problem and overcoming that problem. Right? That is the root of all of our Western storytelling technique. And it includes the hero's journey. They're usually an emotional arc, but not always. At its simplest form, that's what a good story is. So that the more you add in high stakes, urgency, emotional vulnerability, why this is so important to somebody, and then that is stacked on top of this person is trying to overcome this problem, that's when you have a good story. And unfortunately, conferences and spreadsheets are usually not immediate. They don't have high stakes. They don't have any action. And so I've worked on enough TV and feature docs to know that, you have to build in things that'll make somebody watch something. People even leave a conference in the middle of the talk sometimes. So yeah, and I'm happy to go through more of those storytelling techniques if you're interested.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Very much interested because the setup of those conferences, the formats, the meetings that leaders and employees and people are used to, or working with started before there was the Netflix and the Primes and the options that people have been accustomed to. And so companies are competing. It's so essential that sustainability is not only about spewing facts and the truths and expect, people to grasp it, take action or change minds and influence as well. So
I would argue also that part of the reason we're so far behind in culture shift and change on a climate level in terms of removing fossil fuels out of our atmosphere is because of scientists were the ones to tell the story for since the 1950s, when the scientists that were working for ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, Chevron, when they knew that their products were causing these detrimental impacts to the world, and then they, shifted the blame and said it wasn't true. Then other scientists were, basically fighting the spin campaign. And so scientists, there are some scientists that have been, speaking out from an emotional viewpoint, and the ones that have gotten a lot more traction, like Peter Kalmus chaining himself to a bank and then crying on camera. He's a scientist, and that made a bigger impact than probably some of his work. And so I think it's important to really marry the head and the heart, and that's what storytelling does. That's what the arts do. And I'll give you an example. So I was a producer for a very good documentarian for many years called Lauren Greenfield. She won Sundance. She did a film called Queen of Versailles. She also, together, we did this film called Generation Wealth. That was Amazon's first theatrically distributed documentary. But she also, little known fact, unless you kind of dive deep into her background, she did a commercial that became the #1 Super Bowl ad in 2015, and it was called Always Like a Girl. So it was for the Always brand. And it was that commercial that you probably remember where it was like all these young women on camera, all like kind of like preteen. And it's like she's asking them, show me how you run like a girl. Right. And then they're all, everybody's kind of running like, not quite as bold or as brash or as fast as they could. And then she asked this one specific little girl, and the little girl responds like, I'm going to run as hard and as fast as I can because that's what running like a girl is. Well, this commercial was huge. It was like a culture shift. It was a giant, giant deal for Always. And I think it holds some value into dissecting why it was such a big deal.
right.
What she did was, it was surprising. And that's one of the tenets, I think, of good storytelling. You're looking for a unique perspective that surprises people, because when people are surprised, they keep watching. When I used to be a theater performer, sometimes I would like clap or shout if I felt the audience was like losing focus, because it surprises them into, following back up with you. So she used surprise, that this little girl, like surprise on all elements, that the girls didn't believe that they could run like a girl in a most effective way, but then also that this little girl could. And then, but it was authentic. It was real. It was an unusual perspective. And it tapped into this kind of emotional truth, which is what a good story arc is, right? A story arc. And the reason humans like story arcs is because a story connects seemingly random events happening in our lives, and it kind of lifts the veil to understand the underlying current that connects everything together. So why you on your deathbed understand that moment when you were a child, when something happened, and then you can understand the connections. That's what beautiful storytelling does. So her commercial, it resonated really deeply with parents, and it was kind of this rallying cry, and a cultural moment, because it was like for women, because women were like, oh my God, when we hit puberty, suddenly we don't think that being a girl is strong or powerful or can run fast, And so she snuck us into this wider view because of that story. And it made a lot of money for Always.
Yeah. Now that's a very good example. There is some school of thought which says like the mind doesn't like surprises. And so that fits well into that. And I'm not an evolutionary expert, but over time, the human mind has been able to see an object and say it's safe or not safe. And so there is a tendency of the mind to try and simplify things. And so the mind thinks that, oh, I've got it. is a girl and wasn't expecting it. And yes, the girl was going faster than perhaps the mind expects it to be. And so trying to grab those attention. So we have in sustainability and climate change where the topic can be a bit dry if you're talking about 1.5 degrees, or the topic can be abstract where people are used to, they check the temperature on their computer or the temperature in their room, and it's, depending on where you are, but if it's a degrees, it's definitely above 20 degrees, right? Whether it's a Fahrenheit, like the numbers are, tens and twenties. But then how we are able to convince people that 1.5 degrees of climate change is an issue, using that as an example of how the conversation have to change, which perhaps this 1.5 degrees is more a sustainability climate change aspect. But from individual basis, I'm just curious to know what are some of the creative ways that you've seen. Yes, it may be the mainstream sustainability or climate science about 1.5 degrees, but in your own climate or environmental storytelling, you've had to adapt it to suit the effective storytelling.
Yeah, I love this question, and I'm not a climate scientist, but I'm knee deep in the science every day. And I think about this a lot because I think you're right. I think 1.5 degrees, which is in Celsius, it's about 2.7 in Fahrenheit for those of us who have Fahrenheit US. That doesn't mean a lot to people because it's like, oh, if it's 80 degrees outside or 82 degrees outside, who cares? I'm still going to go out and tan, in my garden, no big deal. But what I try to do with that is, again, we bring it, something that makes people share something is when it elicits emotion, and humans and loss of community and culture is something that is, that everybody understands. Two of my friends just lost their homes in the Altadena wildfires in Los Angeles and had like 30 minutes to evacuate. So there's so much tenderness around loss and the loss of community, the loss of culture, the loss of generations. So I'll give you an example. And so some of the facts that I love to try to figure out how to storytell is from the book, The Uninhabitable Earth by journalist David Wallace Wells, who writes for The New Yorker, and he's an incredible thinker. He'll take like the 1.5 or 2 degrees if we go past, the 1.5 target by 2030, which it looks like likely that we will. He gives a real life example of what that means. So, for example, a scientist would say, if we go past 1.5 degrees, extreme heat will affect 37% of the globe. But the human story of that is that many of the biggest cities in Asia and the Middle East, it'll be so hot to walk outside in the summer that you will risk heat stroke or death immediately. If we go a little north of 2 degrees, that means 4 times the wildfires in California. That means a lot of the people that I know and love from my 15 years in Los Angeles are going to have to evacuate multiple more times than they would have. My girlfriend who lost her home in the historic Black neighborhood of Altadena, I mistakenly asked her, I said, so did you have anything in storage? And she said, no, girl, my home was my storage. Like everything was in my house. So she lost all the awards she's ever won. She lost her ornaments that she'd collected for Christmas. So she didn't have anything for the Christmas tree. And all she was able to evacuate with was her dog and a suitcase, If we go north of 2 degrees of warming, again, that's the science. The human part of it is we'll lose all the ice. We'll lose all the major ice sheets in the world will begin a permanent and irreversible melt, right? That's the science. The story of that means everything west of I-95 in the U.S., it's 200 feet of sea level rise, 200 feet, right? That means everything west of I-95 is gone in the U.S. That means that every beach you've ever been on, so Enock, I'm sure you have a favorite beach. That beach is gone. My favorite beach is in Negril in Jamaica. My father is from Kingston, but when we'd go, we'd always go to the beach. I can't even imagine not having those beaches. Those beaches will be gone. And the science part of that rising, we would have time to adapt. We would figure out what to do, but it's so immense and it's such a big problem that oftentimes as a storyteller, I try to condense it into these little moments, right? So it's like good storytelling is looking through a keyhole into a larger room. right? So if I were telling the story of north of 2 degrees, all the ice melts, I would tell that story of somebody with their favorite beach and some sort of connection to the beach. So like fishermen, who they have done this for generations. It's their livelihood. You know, they've been fishing on this same beach forever. And it's their grandfather's beach that they lost. It's their father's beach that they lost. And then something happens like, that they realize that they are facing these rising sea levels and they're going to lose that economy and their livelihood. And then, I mean, there's so many examples like that of what we're facing that makes it more palatable and understandable than if we just use these little markers of degrees.
The key conversation really is around making the communication to be about people rather than being abstract. So what other thoughts do you have where the mainstream media sometimes maybe criticize that you may have heard the term climate alarmism, even though it is the truth that they are telling, but how even within that space, there are some who would critique and say, no, it should be about people, just like you explained about the beach, where a perfect example I usually give is about the farmers, which I mentioned, before we started, where if there is excessive rainfall or there is drought, then the farmers' ability to have a higher yield, enough rainfall because they haven't got money to buy expensive irrigation that a well-developed country may have, those sort of irrigation. And so the weather then moving to climate, and then climate moving to the lack of rainfall or water availability, which then decreases their productivity, which then hits their pocket. So you gave
Said.
example. Yeah. So I think that's the core aspect that I'm seeing that from a storytelling perspective. So can you give us any examples from your work where you know, the production has been around the communities that you are able to share from your climate storytelling?
And I would also add to that story, if I were looking at that story, I would look at how that food insecurity leads to war, to outbreaks of violence, right? Because like there's so many connections. I'm just thinking of like the creation of ISIS.
Mm,
And, there's so many connections where a violent group or a war has popped off because of a lack of the resources because of a drought.
yeah.
Right. And so there's a very easy connection there. I mean, I want to tell this story that I think can help starting like the beginning of your question of like, I think it's very hard to shift somebody's mind if their pocketbook depends on it. Right. And so when you were saying climate alarmism, I think we need to be very clear that a lot of the alarmism and denialism came from a very clear kind of targeted campaign to pretend the problem didn't exist from the fossil fuel industry. So my favorite story that illuminates this is there was a 12-year-old girl in 1981 that won her science fair in New Jersey. And this is before Google. This is before Al Gore wrote his book, Earth in the Balance. This is before he did his movie, An Inconvenient Truth. And what she did for her science fair was she took two little Washington monuments and she put Washington Monument, for those out not in the US, that's the obelisk in DC, the long thing. So she took miniaturized versions of that, put thermometers on them, put them in two glass bowls, separate bowls, and one she left uncovered, one she put a plastic wrap over, and then she put a heat lamp on top of both of them. And she was basically proving the greenhouse gas effect, that if you have rising temperatures, but there's a blanket over the earth, then it'll cause those temperatures to keep rising. And she, rightfully so, the plastic wrap one had a higher temperature than the open Washington Monument. So she won her science fair. But what's interesting to me about this story is how did a little girl in 1981, without Google, before the IPCC reports, this is even before Kyoto. This is before the Kyoto Protocol and the UN climate UNF triple C. How did she know about this? Well, the reason she knew about it was because her father, Henry Shaw, was a scientist for ExxonMobil. He was a scientist that knew that their products were going to cause irreparable harm to the planet. So, and they've known since the 1950s. So what they did is criminal. What they did was they made us lose 60 years of action on a livable planet. 60 years of action to address the depletion of species, to address what's happening with the warming of the oceans. We lost 60 years of time. So I'm not really partial to believing like the climate alarmism is coming out of nowhere. They did very targeted campaigns, even taking out op-eds in the New York Times saying that the science was not clear when it was, and their own scientists knew it enough that this little 12-year-old girl could win her science fair. So that's what I'm talking about with the climate alarmism. As far as other stories with, can you say your second part about like what specifically what kind of stories you're looking for from me
Yeah,
with
it was
climate?
more the people related aspect where the impact, if I go back to the drought and the rainfall, which is affecting people, do you have any projects you've worked on and how you were able to amplify the people aspect, the people impact? It might even be what you shared with the wildfires in California. I'm not sure if you've done any projects around that and how you were able to amplify. I think I'm looking for how the methods you would have used. So this is more like a technical aspect without
Hmm.
us pretending to want to learn the technical aspect of how to amplify the human suffering related to climate or sustainability.
So I haven't done a direct flooding story, although I have talked to folks in Asheville about a potential future story. They got hit by a hurricane that decimated their town in
Mm,
North Carolina. We are a part of a coalition that is trying to reconfigure how we respond to natural fossil fuel disasters like Hurricane Melissa in Jamaica. This is kind of an aside, but we basically are trying to create ready to go storytelling that can immediately respond to a disaster and link it to climate. So like, for example, Hurricane Melissa, of course, they always starts talking about infrastructure and management when something like this happens. But Hurricane Melissa was almost a category 6, which is above a 5, which is outside of the realm of categories. So it was the intensity and frequency were a direct relation to climate. And so, we want to be talking about that connection from the human perspective of rebuilding. I've done stories in Hawaii of a community fighting for community solar against their monopoly utility. And the reason they need community solar, like a lot of indigenous communities, is that there are a lot of people that are unelectrified. On Molokai, which is an indigenous Hawaiian island, on the Navajo reservation, there's a lot of unelectrified hogans, which are like Navajo homes. And the reason is because it's long distances to connect one home to the next, and the utility usually makes people pay for it themselves to put up a pole. And so I've done stories of people fighting for solar, community solar in those neighborhoods so that they can have means of living, if a disaster occurs. The case in Hawaii, they have one road that runs around the island that is probably going to go underwater. And that one road is how people get goods from the barge that drops it off. It's the most remote island in the world. And so they have goods that come in from the mainland that people need to survive. And then they have this one road to get those goods to their home. And so if people have community solar, at least they have an ability to have a fridge to refrigerate their medications if they need. So they can, they can level up in their lives and feel like they're succeeding. I've done stories like that. I've done stories of communities fighting pipelines and what the pipelines would do. Like we went up to Anishinaabe territory on White Earth Nation. Winona LaDuke led us around, and they were fighting a pipeline called Line 3, which was going to cut through their wild rice territory, which is where they harvest the first food served and the last food eaten at indigenous ceremonies in Anishinaabe lands. And that, an oil pipeline could, if there was a spill, it could destroy everything they know. And so all of these stories have the high stakes. Like there's something deep, there's something that the characters could lose because of this scenario. And then we target it to, so I like to jerry rig a story into what is it doing? Who is it targeted towards? Who is the audience, and how can they help with the situation? So I'll give you another example. So there was a train that derailed in Ohio, in a town called East Palestine, Ohio. The train caught fire and it was carrying vinyl chloride, which is a super, super toxic chemical. This wasn't getting a lot of mainstream press. And so I went in with a camera team and we basically asked the community, like, what do you need? And the town had decided to blow up this vinyl chloride over the town. It just was insane that they did that. So it was like a mushroom cloud of chemicals, and the town started getting sick. Kids were having eye problems, rashes, breathing problems. And so we asked the community, what do you need? And they said, we want FEMA funds to declare this an emergency. We want vinyl chloride to never travel on a train again because this is so dangerous, this stuff. And we want it banned. And so with the piece that we created, which had all of the elements of good storytelling, like high stakes, emotional vulnerability, a mom who cares deeply about her child's health. But then what we did was we partnered with an organization called Beyond Plastics, because plastics are fossil fuels' last ditch attempt to stay alive. You know, most plastics are made from fossil fuels, right? So it's their technique to shift away because they know that the jig is up, right? So we partnered with Beyond Plastics, and then we sent the piece to EPA regional, Environmental Protection Agency regional officials, and EPA federal, so that they could see it and see what this blowing up this vinyl chloride did to this town and how scientists were finding it in the water and elsewhere. And because of our film, the EPA put it on the list of chemicals to consider banning. So it had a direct result. And that's because the piece was emotional and scary. You know, we started with a mom evacuating with her child in the middle of the night, and she doesn't know why there are all these like cop cars there. And you know, and this mushroom cloud blew up right by her home is right on a waterway, you know, and she wanted to stay in her town and she had to evacuate. So that's a long way of saying, like, I think there's a way of, especially with social media, you can target anybody you want, you know, like you can see in real time if the person that you want to have eyes on your piece sees your piece. So you can get as many views on social media as you can on a TV show or on a feature doc, arguably more. So I think it's very, especially you can build an organic audience, but you can also do paid advertising where you can like go directly to the people that you want to influence.
Yeah.
But key is knowing what moves them, right?
Your focus on moving away from extraction system of the economy, of the linear economy system into the regenerative economy. What are some of the interesting storytelling you've used around the regenerative system for the audience or the listener who doesn't know much about regenerative? Can you share any around that?
So, you know, I don't think the terms just transition or regenerative, I don't know if they're the best terms to use. You know, even sustainable sometimes is confusing. Like it can be wonky. Think it's like systems that stay for many generations without harming anything. You know, and what's hard about the civilization that we currently have is that we've set up all of this is make believe, right? All of this we've created. And the particular system we've created right now is a civilization that's based on a humans first value system that you know, doesn't incorporate ecosystems into the spreadsheets, into the balance sheets, and it doesn't incorporate ecology into the economy. And so I often look for stories that switch that narrative. Luckily, the indigenous are always they already know how to live in right relation. They already know how to live in a regenerative way of being. And I think that brings me a lot of inspiration, even if I can't always film with the indigenous. They're amazing because they already have that knowledge of how we can take in the intrinsic value of non-living species and non-living beings into the story. I think that, you know, right now it feels like humans aren't belonging to this place and we think we're beyond this place, kind of like the Elon Musks wanting to go to Mars and whatnot. But humans are only a part of nature. And as such, I don't think we can do anything that supersedes ecological balance, like the general environmental balance, because I feel like when we do, we suffer. And we're seeing the signs of that right now. So some of the stories I've already mentioned, like the Anishinaabe and like honoring their wild rice. I worked with Black veterans in Detroit, who they came home with PTSD and they saw their city look like a war zone because Detroit, you know, has had a blight problem. A lot of the old houses are kind of falling apart. And so when they came back from their time at war, they had PTSD. And so they started like regenerating the homes in their hometown of Detroit. And they found that that was like a type of therapy. That piece was called We Want Green Too. And it was just a beautiful little piece that actually has gone to a bunch of film festivals since. So I think people really resonated with this idea of like, you can solve the emotional problems you're having from having your best friend die in your arms when you're at war to taking a home that is run down and then fixing it up with all these green principles and solar panels and like having it be a regenerative, And so we actually can see the house become green as the house becomes a metaphor for the person. Like the person is becoming like more whole themselves as it's happening. So that's a piece. And then produced a piece with journalists in Florida, the Sunshine State. It gets a lot of sunshine here in the US, and it has like almost no solar. Like the state has been fighting solar power. It's a red state. And these journalists, again, so a story is confronting a problem. A story is not just talking about things, right? I think that's a common misunderstanding of storytelling. And I kind of blame the YouTube generation for that, where it's like everybody just thought if I talk about something, that's storytelling. I don't agree. So these journalists, they basically found out that this utility, Florida Power and Light, was hired like this like very shady PR company to wreak havoc on the perception of solar in the state. And they even went so far as to hire a ghost candidate to run against the Democratic candidate so that he would siphon votes away from the Democrat so the Republican could win so that they could kill solar initiatives. And they also had the journalists followed. They had a spy basically taking photos of journalists while they were walking their dogs, while they were like coming home in an Uber from a bar. They were like tracking them and trailing them. And it was all paid for by this utility company who was fighting solar. So basically, like I was looking at the story of Regenerative from an action point of view. How do we tell a story where people are happy in the sun and solar and, everybody wants solar and like things are growing, but how do we tell that and make it interesting? And so in that short documentary, we created like a spy thriller of these journalists who were confronting this utility that was doing these malfeasant actions to stop what they were doing and the release of information.
That's a very good practical examples that we can relate with. As a final thought or a parting message for the audience, what would you want to share for those who clearly, we can see you've got a passion and the hope where they can carry on with the enthusiasm while the sustainability, the climate change, the regenerative space?
Well, so I know that your audience is mostly business people. Climate is and will disrupt lives and economies and businesses and ecosystems. We're already seeing that. It's going to get exponentially worse. Even the US military calls climate a threat multiplier. So having a robust climate policy, I think, is really important for not only individuals, but businesses. Companies that are investing in clean energy and reducing emissions are going to save their costs in the future. They're going to drive innovations, and they're going to signal demand on the market to governments that are not really doing anything at the pace and scale that we should be doing climate action. Pretty much all the countries of the world are behind their climate commitments in terms of decarbonizing. So, but I want to end with a story because I think this is probably my final message. So, when I was in college, so like early 2000s, BP came out with this hero's journey of advertising campaign, British Petroleum. And I think it was around the time they were switching to Beyond Petroleum. They were rebranding their name. I wonder why they did that. Basically, they invented this idea of the carbon footprint, right? And they really pitched it like you can be the hero of this story, right? You as an individual. So they were like, you can change your light bulbs in your house to LEDs, and you can start eating veggie burgers instead of hamburgers, which have a huge carbon footprint. Or you can, drive a Prius, And what was interesting about this was that I bought into this too, And so I was always talking to others, like, about all the things we should do in my environmental clubs in college. Like, we got to go plant-based, we got to do all these things. But what that did is it shifted the focus away from the biggest criminal of all, which was the fossil fuel industry. Because there's no way a single mom, who's changing her light bulbs and driving a Prius is going to even compare to the billions of tons of emissions that are being spewed by this polluting industry. There's just no comparison. So I like to think about that story about this carbon footprint being invented by the fossil fuel industry as the leverage point for me to think about how my individual actions can be the strongest leverage point I have. So not just like how I can do, A through Z of like little fixes, but what are the fixes that will help the most, the fastest? right? Like really ordering your thoughts around it and really taking inventory of what am I doing that can help the fastest? Because we have an urgent crisis on our hands. So we have to use the biggest levers that we have, and we have to stop pretending that it's about an individual footprint, that it's about a big footprint. So some of the things I advocate, we have to vote in climate politicians. And luckily, there are amazing groups in the US like the Sunrise Movement who are literally finding those candidates and pushing them to get into politics so that people that are in charge of systems know what is the point. We have to support global initiatives like the UNFCCC, not withdraw like the US just did. We need to divest our homes, not just our homes. So all of our electricity, but our cars, our wallets, our pensions, our towns, our states, our countries away from fossil fuels. And so one of the biggest things, one of the bigger leverage points is change your bank. Banks are investing a huge amount of money into future fossil fuel extraction. They keep the fossil fuel industries afloat. So like, for example, Chase, it invests about 196 billion in future fossil fuel extraction. So if you have Chase Bank, get the F out. And there's a really good, every year, the Rainforest Action Network does a good banking on climate chaos report where you can see the rankings of different banks. That's a huge one. We also have to push or boycott companies that are intentionally stalling climate action. And I personally am getting inspiration right now from the Black boycott of Target in the States. Target divested from DEI, and every Black person said nope. And so they boycotted Target. I still haven't been to Target since they did that. And they lost about 12 billion and a CEO's job. So we have a lot of power. And so we can influence companies. We can signal demand by our actions. And then, so we have to push or boycott those companies, become more plant-based, and encourage systems change with it. Agriculture and meat is a huge contributor, but instead of just like a meatless Monday, which is like an individual thing, you can, if you have a conference, if you're setting up a conference, you can use a plant-based default. So instead of meat being the default, have plant-based food be the default, and then meat is the option. I think about that every time I fly on an airplane because it's always like, I'm vegetarian for like 28 years now, and the option is always the vegetarian. And I'm always like, what if the main meals are vegetarian or plant-based, and then you can order the meat if you want it? Right? So then most people don't care. They'll opt into the plant-based and you've solved the system, right? So at the end of the day, it's like we had the fossil fuel industry do some sleight of hand on us. They did a magic trick, right? And they did it with very clever advertising, but we're savvy to it now. And I would just encourage everybody to think about the leverage points that'll have the most bang for the buck, that you can actually see some bigger change faster.
Yeah, that's very good, showing the power of we may be individuals, but when we come together, we have more leverage than we probably can imagine. So thank you so much for that reminder. A huge thank you to Maya for your time, the incredible insights, the hope, the enthusiasm, really good. If listeners want to find more of your work, Maya, where can they find you?
You can always email us any ideas for stories at theyearsproject.com. We are always open to collaborations. We're a nonprofit, so, oftentimes we work with private foundations who want to fund us about specific stories, particularly BIPOC and frontline. So reach out, theyearsproject.com. You can follow us online at Years of Living or at The Years Project. And then I personally am at Gung Ho Eco, which is a name that I made many, many years ago, mostly because somebody else had Maya Lilly on Instagram and still hasn't given that up, despite not using it for 10 years. So if anybody wants to grab me at Maya Lilly, I'd be grateful.